Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session at cogX. I hope you're all enjoying the last 2 days, one more day to go. Today, we're going to talk about the Healthcare for All session, and we've got three very distinguishing panel speakers. My name is Hitesh Thakrar. I'm going to be your panel host. My background is in investing primarily in public markets, in technology and life sciences for 25 years. Currently, I have a number of different roles now. I'm on the board of the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Artificial Intelligence and Data Science. I'm a partner at Syncona, which is a Wellcome Trust-backed therapeutics fund focusing on cell and gene therapy. And I'm also an early stage investor in deep tech companies at Series A. So I'm going to go around, talk and get our three panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and then we've got some questions which we'll run through. Please keep this interactive. We've got access to the chat and the Q&A, and we'll try and keep up with all the questions and interesting dialogue. But we're going to start with Mary, who can just tell us a bit about herself and what she does at Summers. Mary, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel today. So my name is Mary Mulcair. I am based in the US out of the sort of New York, Connecticut market. And I'm the rising chief medical officer for Sumis Global. I actually start July 1st, technically. But I'm very much looking forward to it. I've been their senior medical advisor for the last 3 of the 5 years that the company has been in existence. And what Sumis is, it's the leading virtual specialist platform for employees and large group employers. And basically what we do is try and connect our clientele with leading experts in whatever the medical field is that they have questions, have issues, need help with going forward. And, we'll obviously talk about that more in detail going forward. My current day job is as an emergency medicine physician in New York City at New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medicine, where I've been for the last 17 years. My subspecialty is geriatric emergency medicine. So 80 and up is my wheelhouse of age group that I enjoy dealing with. And I'm also the director of undergraduate medical education there. So I do a lot of med student education and, work in developing curriculums and implementing new educational endeavors and a lot of telemedicine education on that front too.
Thank you, Mary. Dor, do you want to introduce yourself?
Happy to, and thanks for having me on. So I'm Dor Schooler. I'm the founder and CEO of Intuition Robotics. Sorry about my voice. I had a cold a few days ago. The Intuition Robotics is a 5-year-old startup company. We create empathetic digital companions that are able to crack a code on how to actually give empathy to AI, and through that create a brand new level of patient engagement. We're a team of 100 people. We've raised over $58 million. I'm based in Israel. Our team is split between Israel and the United States with a contingency in Greece as well. And our focus primarily is on, also kind of like Mary, on the 65 plus population with a product called EliQ. See her up on the shelf here. EliQ is a proactive companion that lives with older adults and engages with them in conversation, engages with them in nudges, helps alleviate the feeling of loneliness and social isolation, helps with wellness, such as mindfulness and cognitive stimuli and better nutrition and hydration, physical exercise. And we'll be announcing at the end of this month our entry into primary care, where essentially EliQ will be part of the way that healthcare is delivered to older adults at home, working very, very closely with value-based care.
Great, very interesting. Thank you for that. Now, Shad, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Everybody, it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm Darshak Savi. I'm speaking to you from San Francisco, California, although I'm typically based in Boston. I'm the Global Chief Medical Officer for Babylon Health. Like Mary, I'm relatively new, although I've been in this position for about a month or so. And Babylon Health is essentially a technology-enabled platform that specializes in both virtual visits and really an entire end-to-end journey for patients throughout the healthcare system. We originally started in the UK, although we serve a number of other geographies. The technology is used in Rwanda, in Asia Pacific area. It's been licensed in Canada. and now is expanding to the United States. And one of the key areas of expansion now is for us, particularly in the US, to take what's called full global risk on patients' health. In other words, to have all of the financing or healthcare expenses, to have Babylon responsible for that. And so we would really develop an entire journey throughout both the health loop as well as what we would call the sick loop to navigate those patients through that entire spectrum of care. And we serve a number of different markets in the United States, and will be expanding significantly over this year as well. And my background is I'm a pediatric cardiologist. I take care of children with complex heart defects. I still see patients and have experience in policy, having served in the Obama administration at Optum and United Health Group, the Brookings Institution, and in academic medical centers. And I also practiced for a few years on a Navajo reservation in a significantly underserved part of the United States. So again, it's a pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you, Darshak, for that introduction. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask some general questions, and then I've got some specifics for each of our three panelists. And let me kick off with really the last 12 months. So as I mentioned at the start, I've spent like 30 years in investing in innovation, from big mainframes including punch cards to what we have today. And of course, lots of crises happens, and this is my fourth or fifth financial crisis. And you worry that the world is going to end and all innovation is dead. Because what happens is new innovation emerges, and it was always there, but it was percolating away. And the way I think about health and data is percolating away 4 or 5 years ago, slowly, from early days, from even what IBM were doing with Watson. But of course, it feels like it's changed dramatically in the last 12 months. And it, like all innovation, it's slow at the beginning, and then suddenly when it emerges very quickly. So my opening question to the panelists, and we'll go around, is, do you feel the last 12 months have been a watershed in what you do? And when you look back, do you think it's changed permanently, that this emergence of this new industry? Or is it going to be still slow development, slow innovation? Who wants to kick off on that first? Mary, I can see you first. So.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Happy.
Different people on my screen, you're first. So do you want to kick off on the last 12 months, how it's affected you?
Sure. Yeah, and there are many ways to take that question from my current day job through to my SUMAS experience. The last 12 to 16 months in New York City has been quite the adventure, especially in all of our emergency departments and being on the front line of it. I think that, one of the biggest things that emerged from this, and one of the greatest things, I think, is the advancements in virtual healthcare. We went from sort of dabbling and kind of doing it a little on the side, a relatively small percentage of the patients that were being seen across, and I'm speaking about the US because that's what I'm most comfortable with, but very small percentage of the patients we saw were actually treated in a telemedicine platform, virtual care platform. And now over the last year, that percentage has jumped considerably, obviously. And I think virtual healthcare is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And I think it's been a very interesting test case in how it works. And it's beyond, just emergency, right? In the emergency department, emergency physicians, we tend to be a little bit more comfortable adapting quickly, moving quickly. We're used to being on our toes most of the time, but telehealth has moved way beyond that, right? Primary care practices had to pick it up very quickly. Specialists had to pick it up very quickly, right? So a lot of our subspecialists learned how to do post-op visits virtually, right? Which is something that if you asked them 16 months ago, they probably wouldn't have considered that as part of their practice. But the reality is physicians jumped right in, and they're good at it, and they're comfortable with it. And I think it's here to stay, and people want to keep making it part of a practice. It makes us much more efficient and allows us to see more people and do more things. And then finally, from the emergency perspective, speaking about, we'll get into sort of cost containment discussions, but I think, virtual care allows the emergency department to truly function as an emergency department if virtual care is built correctly and used correctly, on all fronts, and we, in emergency, we trained because that's what we like to do. We like to take care of people when, we're the safety net, right? When everything else doesn't quite seem to line up, or they're too sick and they need to land with us. That's what we're there for. And that's who we're there to care for. And I think we're there to care for everybody. But the reality is, that's what we're really ultimately trained to do. And I think that if virtual care takes off the way it has and continues to do things correctly and continues to innovate the way that it's rapidly happened, emergency departments will be allowed to function as emergency departments going forward.
Great. I'm going to bring in Darshak because obviously that's a natural segue because your business has literally exploded and about to explode onto the public market.
Yeah.
So, do you want to come in on that follow on?
Sure. Building on what Mary said, I mean, so I can say that previously we know, I think there are 2 or 3 themes. The first is that what we've learned is that there's an enormous appetite for digital and virtual care. However, in the US in particular, it was incredibly underused for the simple reason that people didn't pay for it. And so what we noticed last year was the pandemic obviously occurred, but the critical catalyst was that the payers started to pay full rates for virtual visits that would match in-person rates. So as soon as that happened, there was an enormous investment in making that technology easier. And the other piece, which is equally critical, was a relaxation of a number of the regulatory barriers that, privacy concerns. And, we served at that time in my prior role, people over the age of 65. It's very difficult for them to, authenticate and do a bunch of, all of that was waived. We could just use FaceTime. We could use Google Chat and a number of other features. And we saw a 14,000% increase within 3 to 4 weeks of the initial passage. So an enormous amount of use. So I think that was the first thing. The second is that historically, one of the excuses given for not using technology-based platforms is that people who are older, people who are economically disadvantaged, or those from certain parts of the country won't be able to use technology. It's too hard for them. We also realize that that is entirely not the case. And the data has borne that out. And I think, again, that investment in actually reaching people who typically may not get care is something we're seeing. And Babylon learned that actually, for example, in their expansion in Rwanda. We're also seeing that now increasing in the US with a number of populations that can use those platforms. So I think that combination of both payment as well as simply regulatory issues and user-centric design, that's really the story of what we've seen over the past year if we're going to unlock virtual care.
Thank you. I've been told to disable my video in terms of some this issue on bandwidth. Dor, can I ask you to come in because you're coming from a hardware world? Again, lots of innovation in that space, and you seem to have brought it together with software. So tell us a bit about your journey.
Yeah, so I'll try only to be additive. So obviously I agree with everything that was said. I think we saw a few other kind of tailwinds. The first is obviously a move towards home healthcare and digitalization into the home, which was always talked about, but especially in the geriatric world where nobody wanted to ask an older adult to leave their home and expose themselves to the virus, that became an obvious thing to invest in, even leaving the pandemic. I think the second, which to us was extremely important, we've been around for a few years now and kind of talking about the importance of loneliness and social isolation for the health and well-being of older adults. And it was always realized as important, but was never actionable. Nobody really did anything. And I think we saw that during the pandemic, payers specifically understood the importance of that and looking more at the social determinants of health and not only on the delivery of medication, but specifically on loneliness and isolation. And the third that took us actually really by surprise, this is also relevant to Darshak as well, it's on the business model side. You saw that fee-for-service primary care really took a hit, right? Because people didn't come to see them. But practitioners and practices that were working on full capitated risk revenue stream, and were able therefore to really not focus on defensive, how do we stay in business, but to be proactive and how do we provide care to older adults, how do we educate them, how do we help them. And on one side, they thrive because they had a guaranteed revenue stream. On the second side, they thrive because people didn't go to do elective surgeries and elective care, so their cost basis was down. But more importantly, it looks like they were able to really offer kind of the promise of value-based care and be proactive with your patients and offer a lot of value add. And I think on the back of all of those three trends, we're seeing it not go away at all. I mean, we can discuss hospital and home, starting with other things, and for us, it's just a tremendous tailwind going into a medical.
So I think that's a really good point about the structural change. And we all three of you touched on regulation, and one of the reasons vaccines, which have typically take 10 years, was done in 10 months, was the FDA blasting through the regulations on all sorts of clinical trials, etc. Do you feel, those who interact with the FDA, that this is a structural change? Already the controversy around the Biogen approval last week, lots of discussion whether it should have been approved, etc. But is the FDA thinking with a different hat now, or is it all these things were temporary and then we'll go back to traditional regulation? Anybody want to take that?
I'm happy to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
So we were involved previously, at least in my prior roles, in, for example, getting home-based testing kits approved by the FDA for COVID. You can imagine that was an immediate need. We didn't want people going into clinics and so forth and getting exposed if they were positive. And what we did see is a fairly rapid pace for the FDA to work on home-based testing kits, which is now going to lead to the dividends of a number of home-based tests that can hopefully be provided. But having said that, around with FDA, as with everything else in regulatory policy, I'm speaking with a US-centric lens, the answer is it's very complicated. Because let's take the Biogen approval. Obviously, I think many of us are highly critical just on the face of it in terms of the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness in particular of this drug. But what's not as well understood is that this is a post hoc analysis of a study that was performed. And to some extent, it's really taking advantage and in some people's views, subverting an accelerated approval process, which is designed to get important and breakthrough drugs to the public quickly. So in a sense, what we're finding is this is a loophole. The whole idea of that quote loophole was to allow important medications and technologies to reach people that really need it. And what we find is it's being subverted. So on the one hand, that very same push to get key therapies out to the public, and one could argue vaccines, this is sort of the push me pull you of how this is going to be potentially exploited. And I think that that's sort of the story here. What many of us might argue is that the accelerated approval process is what really needs to be particularly worked on. And I think that the Biogen approval may in fact be that sort of catalyst, again, this is to use the same word I did before, to actually prompt review and thoughtful approaches to that. And a miscellaneous issue is simply, particularly again, taking a US-centric view, because that's my area of expertise, is our payment policy. The problem is also the incentives are highly problematic here. Unlike in the UK, there is no consideration of cost benefit here. And so any approval triggers mandatory coverage by federal agencies. That may also have to be looked at.
I guess the follow-up question on that really is, regulation in a really rapidly innovating sector where we both, all of us, kind of live in, technology can run ahead of regulation. Do you think that is a constraining factor on your businesses? Or do you think the regulators, not just the FDA, but other global regulators, can see that? And we saw this in the cell and gene therapy space where the technology ran ahead, regulators are now pulling it back again. So is there a challenge around rapidly evolving innovation actually stopping because of these regulatory hurdles? Any thoughts from anyone on that?
Sure, happy to chime in. I mean, look, that's the nature of the beast, right? Regulators are always going to be a step or two behind innovation, and if it's a step or two behind, we're lucky. If it's not 10 years behind, and that's kind of always going to be the nature of the beast. I think what's interesting, you mentioned the global aspect. So I'm hailing from Israel, which was one of the early adopters of vaccinating on a population level on the COVID vaccine. And one of the reasons it was possible is during this time of crisis, the Israeli regulator completely dropped any self-regulation and leaned entirely on the FDA approval process. As far as I know, for the first time ever. And I think it's really interesting to see, on the one side, as innovators, we're always critical of regulation. On the other side, you can see the level of trust that other countries have in the US regulation process, such that they're willing to accept it and go through, mass population health vaccinations based on US regulatory approval without any local inspection. So if you deregulate completely, you wouldn't have that level of trust, and maybe it will allow for innovation, but it won't allow for massive rollout. And there are aspects that will definitely occur because when you talk about vaccines and injections and so on. On the other side, I would love to see like a quick path, right, to really look at the delta or kind of the size of the potential impact versus the probability of it taking place versus the amount of people that are exposed to it, and allow for quicker, maybe small scale adoptions of technologies that have low risk. And I think that we don't have like the accelerator path, right? We don't really have a fast path to say, okay,
well, we do
deploy it in a way that's more limited in view and limit the amount of risk that can be generated there.
I think for rare disease, sorry to interrupt, for rare disease, we've got a fast track path, right? But that affects a smaller population group on that. And as a question to Mary, in your role as emergency doctor, how do you feel about kind of cutting edge medicine, which has not fully gone through the full trial process, etc., and using that if you thought there was a chance, or is it quite conservatively managed generally?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think this is where the question of risk benefit from the patient perspective and patient-centered care really kicks in. A lot of patients with some of these rare diseases are willing to take the risks, and that's their choice. And I think and we have to allow that autonomy to some degree. I think from a clinical practice perspective of emergency medicine, it's a touch terrifying because sometimes we don't know what to do when when people come in with adverse events secondary to these things, and these tend to be people who have other illnesses too, and so sometimes it's a little hard to parse out what's what, but that's part of the clinical challenge of the whole thing.
I want to move on now to each of our panelists and just talk in detail about their companies, and I'm going to start with Dor. We've seen the application of robotics kind of at a high level in things like the Japanese hospitals and the nurses, and there's some kind of look high-tech application, but not in many in the Western world. What you're doing is using technology to a cohort of people who are not familiar. Could you talk us a bit about the challenges around that, and how much of it is kind of how passive is the technology, so actually the interaction level is pervasive, and therefore it doesn't matter too much about the individual whether they have the skills or not to use it?
Yeah, so I think that Darshak spoke a little bit about the importance of user-centric design.
Yeah.
And I think a well-designed product, which does not feel geriatric, it feels empowering, it's delightful. We had the pleasure to design this product with Professor Don Norman from UCSD, who started this whole user-centric design philosophy, and with Yves Bahar, who's an amazing designer. And we worked with over 1,000 older adults just in the pre-design phase of this product to make sure that older adults can, first of all, use this product effectively. And then we had to crack, how do you build a relationship? How do you actually build a real relationship between an AI and a human? Not utilitarian function, but something that gives you acknowledgement, that makes you feel that you're heard, that you're noticed, that's highly personalized, that's with you and provides a projection of empathy towards you. And only once we crack that, did we start looking at the medical applications on how to utilize that for collecting self-reported data, or for increased patient engagement, or better provider-patient communication, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think Japan has a 4 on the US. We're exclusively in the United States. But I think it might have a better appreciation to the power of these type of applications. Case by point, the vast majority of our investors, we've raised $58 million to date. The vast majority of our investors come from Japan. So kind of, the willingness to take the leap, I think, is a bit higher there. Maybe culturally, the willing to accept robots as companions that walk with us through life and help us is a bit higher there. But when you look at actually applied technologies that are not questions and answers, they're not who is, what is, set a timer, but ones that we give space to be with us, to share a space with us, to suggest things to us and affect behavior change in the way we live our lives. That is brand new, uncharted territory. It's much more than pattern recognition. You need to have cognition capabilities, reasoning, decision-making, and to project empathy. So
what the adoption of somebody who is clearly elderly and never used some technology. What have been the challenges around that? I mean, have you had people to switch off, or have you been surprised on the median user? Have they taken to it very easily and very quickly?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is uncharted territory, right? I mean, if you're going to, common wisdom is if you're going to create a new type of tech, which is pushing the boundaries of the state of the art, you probably don't want to deploy it with people in their 80s and 90s that have a hard time using technology. But that's what we did, right? And what we found is that, you know what, older adults are not different than any one of us. It just happened to be a little bit older. And if you make a delightful experience and we use a huge amount of humor, we haven't seen age as a factor at all. Obviously, it's super simple to use, super simple to use. Obviously, you need to be able to communicate very effectively. But you know what? We're getting the same hard questions on privacy and on data usage from people in their 90s that you would expect to get from a millennial. We're seeing people annoyed at us when the product doesn't work, maybe with less filters applied towards our support team than you would somebody that's younger. And what we're able to see is engagement at levels that are really unheard of. I mean, we're seeing more than 90% of the users be at least 5 days of active users per week, even after a year. We're seeing over 150 completed tasks per week, and it's not going down. Even after a year living with the product, it's not going down. So maybe the other side of it is because older adults are at home, because they're more lonely, because they're more isolated, if you do a decent job, they actually depend on the technology maybe more because they just have less choice of products that are designed to be uplifting and delightful for them.
Interesting. So I guess in the network home, we have got multiple devices, not with Alexa obviously is the main one, but Nest and Hive and all of these other devices.
Yeah.
You're trying to kind of integrate those into that, because those are obviously generating and holding data with your system, or are you trying to be a standalone piece of technology?
No, we definitely try to integrate them as kind of think of it as the digital front door, focus on the elder population to be their hub around whether it's contacting their family or whether it's providing important information to their healthcare provider, or connecting to their community, or just interacting between the patient and the robot itself. However, I can tell you, and this is our bias as technologists, when we got started, we said, okay, let's integrate with every smart home device we can find. A smart thermometer and light bulbs and so on. Then you go into the home of an 85-year-old. Frankly, you're not going to find too many smart home devices there. Actually, Wi-Fi is still a major issue. A lot of people that would love LEQ don't have Wi-Fi at home. So I found that actually we spend a lot of work to integrate with all of these things. Where you go into the home of an older adult, it is not a tech-enabled home right now, and we're actually scaling back and saying, okay, what does the user actually need? What are they actually using? What does their doctor actually prescribe? And let's help get a holistic view and help them manage that craziness. But I don't think that you're going to see immediately the rush of all these gadgets in an older adult's home as far as the habits that they're used to and how they operate their lifestyle.
It's good point, good observation. Just following up on general use of robotics in healthcare, where do you see the opportunity beyond what you're doing on a kind of medium-term view? What kind of things are you excited about in the application of robotics?
So I think moving into the home, not just for us, but for others as well, is a huge opportunity. There's an exciting company called Embodied that's developing a robot to help autistic children develop social interaction skills in a safe environment in a totally gamified way. You see robotic cats and robotic seals. There's a great New Yorker article that came out a couple of weeks ago exploring that aspect. I think if we started with robotics in surgery and in very, very precise, minimal invasive medicine, I think we're and maybe as an aid to the doctor in diagnostics and doing pre-diagnostic collection of data, I think where you'll see this go is something that's more continuous with the patient, amplifying the patient's abilities, maybe a safe environment that helps overcome some white coat syndromes, and allows the medical community not just to get snapshots and annual wellness visits, but to really get continuous engagement and continuous snapshots on how people are doing in their home environment, in their real environment. And kind of like the difference from seeing a patient in your doctor's office versus doing a home visit is all the difference in the world, right? And I think you're going to see a lot of enabling technology there. The biggest trend that I'm starting to see a push for is around hospital at home. Spoke to one hospital that told me that they're expecting to see 70% of all hospitalization be home-based. And really people coming into the ER, going through triage, and then making a decision point, does the person need to be hospitalized in our location, or can we set up a hospital at home? Imagine the amount of automation that needs to happen, and the person's going to do that effectively, but also the experience of the patient and the lower cost to the healthcare system if they don't need to provide the bed and allow people to just spend time at home. So I think you're going to see home push a lot of innovation in robotics and elsewhere.
Do you think the technology hurdles being developed then now is an adoption issue, i.e. we've got range of semiconductors, for example, we've got user-created designs, so it's an adoption thing, or is there step change technologies you still need to develop, particularly around artificial intelligence, understanding context, what a person says, and does the AI understand it? Where do you think we are on that curve?
I think we're seeing the entire curve being touched. So on one side, it's on the perception aspects, right? I mean, you have cameras now that can do heart rate, oxygen levels in the blood, stress levels, etc., all through cameras, like minimally invasive through regular iPhone cameras. You're seeing companies on the AI front doing actual diagnostics, like diagnostic robotics and others that are aids to physicians in making their decisions. Sensors are dirt cheap because of the cell phone and smartphone industry, gyroscopes, Apple watches doing EKGs. I mean, it's every place you look is being absolutely disrupted. And I think if you look at the stack, it's okay, data collection from sensors, AI or otherwise, or machine learning or otherwise, combining that data and creating trends, analyzing that data, but also down to reasoning, cognitive decision making, and actual engagement of people, which will hopefully allow the physicians to focus on where you really need the human. You really need the ability to make connections on the spot, the ability, I mean, in geriatrics, we see that a lot of the symptoms for the underlying reasons are the same, but the reasons are different, and it takes the human to really understand what's going on with that patient. It's not just a collection of symptoms equals a disease. It's really that special sauce. And
so we have a question on this really about how robots can pick up signs and also do the empathy part. Is that a kind of algorithm effectively, or lots of machine learning? I guess the question follow is how accurate is something like that? Is the empathy challenge? It's obviously a big challenge in AI.
Yeah, so to be clear, first of all, robots don't feel empathy, okay? But AIs and companions are able to project empathy towards the person, so he can tell the difference. And doing that is a combination of art and science. On the art side, I can tell you we have behavioral psychologists. We have people that curate and create content. We recently hired somebody that won the Cannes Film Festival for a short film he made, right? So there's part of that, the character, the showing of emotion, the modalities of movement and not just speech, and all of that together with decision making. How do you know if you can even interrupt a person and be proactive? Is this a good time to interrupt? What should you promote right now? How do you help the person achieve goals that they're going after? And how do you take into account their primary care provider's goals for that person? So there's a lot of learning. There's a lot of reinforcement learning as well. There's a lot of personalization, but there's also a lot of new areas in cognitive computing, reasoning, and decision making. But that alone won't cut it. You need the art part, you need the psychology part, you need the character and the humor. And when you combine those two things together, with very, very hard work, you're able to crack this code.
Right, on that cue, I am going to interrupt and move on to Darshak and just move on to what Babylon have been doing. Apologies. So let's go with Babylon, Darshak. And just, I guess the feature that the Babylon's been a bit different from some of the other companies in that they've started with AI quite aggressively in hiring software engineers, etc., from the beginning. Given the legacy challenges which IBM Watson faced, what was the reason for doing that, and what advantage have you developed from having quite software people right from the beginning?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think what we're realizing increasing in this world is that AI and what we call deep learning and all of these technologies, they're really enablers. And the idea is that they all have to be very clinically informed. So in my view, data scientists, all that stuff, it's increasingly a commodity. I often hear, oh, we'll have a connected world and we'll get data from all these places. And I just think about my own experience as a physician right now, like having more data is not my problem. Like I'm overwhelmed with data, you know, from the EHR to the 50 sources of connected devices and all that. What we need is people that actually solve problems that are worth solving and do it in a thoughtful way that actually then leads to significant improvement in patient outcomes. So that's the focus that we need to be on here. So I'd say with IBM Watson, one of the challenges was it was never clear what problem they were actually solving. They never developed a product that anybody really wanted. It was AI for the sake of AI as broadly as, in my view, as a marketing tool. At Babylon, one of the things they solve for is something very simple, which is somebody has a concern. Typically, the strategy is it's a telephone call or trying to get in touch with a physician or nurse to help talk through the symptoms. And so they started with a very specific problem, which is a symptom checker. Using AI as a way, and again, it's a very simple loop. You sort of ask questions, you get additional data, and you zero in on a question, and then you can educate the model. What I like about that approach is very similar to sort of image challenges as well. It's very the training model is very clear, and you're solving a problem that's worth solving. And I think that sort of, at least if we start with that at the kernel, then we think about, well, what else can we solve for that is particularly important? I'll just give one other example of how deep learning, which is the problem of using clinician time well and appointments. Think about when you call currently. I can say it's from my own hospital where I work in an academic medical center. You talk to a person, they go through schedules, you sort of talk, you sort of ask them, do you need to be seen tomorrow, the next week? Those are all things that can be automated in really thoughtful ways. It is an ideal place to use that type of intelligence. So one thing I'll just say with Babylon, and hopefully what infuses the way we think about using technology, is to first simply start with what is the problem that's worth solving, that either the market is looking to solve, a health system is looking to solve, or a patient needs to be solved. Be super clear about what that solution pathway looks like, and only then throw the technology resources at it to solve for that particular problem. That's the reproducible framework we seek to use. And also, I'll just say the other reason we're taking on full risk, because it's when we have the risk, we can then actually define those problems and actually solve them in meaningful ways.
Okay. The gating challenge, I guess, for all of the online providers, it's the lack of meaningful diagnostic data. You kind of outsource that collection to the patient, whether it's good or bad, it's hit and miss. It can be hit and miss. What do you see anything on the horizon? I mean, people talk about tactile technologies and different ways of collecting the ENT data. How do you think we can overcome that limitation? Because clearly online triage can only go so far. At some point, you do need to have a physical examination, don't you?
Yes.
How do you address that challenge?
Yeah, so I think I'd start with saying that I would challenge the fact that we are really getting the most we possibly can out of the patient's history and the interview. I would argue there is an enormous amount of additional data that can be gathered just by talking to a patient. I'd have to say, even in my own clinical experience, both as a subspecialist dealing with a highly complex patient population and my experience in primary care, I would say 9 times out of 10, or probably more, simply by the appropriate history, discussion, visual, one can zero in on a diagnosis, or at least determine what the next tests are that are necessary. And actually then develop strategies to get that testing done. So I would argue that this notion on sensors first, and that's going to solve all our problems. That needs to be radically re-examined. I feel like that's totally being driven by technologists with little understanding of real health care.
But it's also where primary physicians work, and Mary can probably talk about that, right? First thing you take your measurements and vitals and
yes,
things
yes.
like that. So there's a whole cultural change from doctors who are trained.
Yes.
Does that create a challenge?
Oh, that's a good point. I mean, I'd say, measurements and vitals, it's sort of a routine. People come to expect it. And I would argue that what's equally important is creating a sense of connection is sort of the goal of that. You sit down with the nurse, she takes your blood pressure, and then the other medical assistant, he may weigh you and measure you. You start to feel a little comfortable. There's some argument to be made for that as well. But I'll say, just coming back, in terms of sensors and so forth, you're raising a very good point, which is specifically visual information, auditory information, and being able to get that kind of data is very, very important. Again, I would just argue to do it thoughtfully. I'll just give one example, which is specifically dermatologic problems in particular are a very good target. Home-based iPhone and or Android cameras are incredibly high resolution. The color balancing is very good. And so photography of lesions or concerns in that area, that's the perfect example of what arguably could be called sensor technology. That's the kind of information that if we can improve that flow would be really easy. I'll give one other example, which is simply taking a photograph of your prescription bottles and then machine reading the text on them is another very good, very simple example of actually getting medication information is an enormously complex task, but through technology and sort of wise design can be solved in that way.
I met an insurance company, one of the major insurance companies recently, who are using using AI to look at a person's face and diagnose their BMI. But there's so much data they can predict what the BMI is going to be. Because in emerging markets, there's no medical history.
Right.
So you can price insurance.
Push on that. Not to sort of be difficult here, but looking at somebody's face to tell if they're overweight, that is not a problem that the medical community is crying out to have solved. Yeah. But I would just put a push on that.
It's more an AI example.
Yeah.
It's AI guys. So they can do it. Dasha, the question I guess I have from all of this is a big issue around privacy and data. And we've had some challenges in the UK recently around private data to NHS. What are your thoughts on what you've come across and how you've handled the privacy and data challenge?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And privacy and data is an underpinning of what we need to have in order to have faith in the medical system. Because I think ultimately, what's at the core of an appropriate physician or patient system is that foundation of trust. And if we lose that trust, that's extremely harmful for many reasons. What I will say is that in my view, let me start with the world I know and then build more broadly. The problem has largely been that the privacy protections are incredibly, people are very risk averse. So even the theoretical risk of some information on 1 in several million people being exposed outweighs the other concern, which is that I can tell you, I have 2 children, they're 19 and 16. For the 16-year-old, I need to get a hold of some medical records just to send them to school. The number of phone calls, fax, I mean, we still rely on fax to send them in the United States. Arguably, the major problem is that it is impossible for the average person to actually get their own medical information in any way that makes sense. And in fact, as a result, the way that laws are mistakenly interpreted, it's even when you're a parent calling, they won't even release the records to you. So I would say that the obverse of privacy, which is where a lot of the discussion is the fact that you can't even get the most basic data that you need, to say nothing about the costs of your care, the way who's actually negotiating that information. So in my view, at least in the US market, one of the largest challenges is liberating data so people can actually control it.
Do you not think the HIPAA regulations industrialize some of the data? Did that not solve the issue?
I would invite anybody who believes that to be the case to try and consolidate their own medical records for any type of more than minimally invasive procedure in the US. It is an enormous challenge.
Very good. Let's move to Mary. And Mary, you work for Summers, which is a business model that allows clients to access more specialists. through a platform. What are the benefits you're seeing from having such a platform, and the challenges really, because you're allowing price discovery, right, which means lower profits for people in the value chain.
Right. Yeah, no, thanks for the question. So I think, so, the first question is always, what is Sumus, right? So Sumus focuses on getting clients access to the best medical expertise quickly across all health concerns, right? And data shows that access to high quality specialists early in a patient's journey leads to better, more cost efficient outcomes, right? So in the US, and I apologize for being US centric, that's sort of what I know. So for US companies, 5% of the population tends to drive 50 to 60% of healthcare costs, right? That's not a secret. So there's a clear benefit to both patients and companies in using our model. For patients, it's peace of mind, right? It's understanding their illness, it's understanding the spectrum of their illness, understanding the path that they should be on, maybe need to be on, in order to get the best care that they can possibly get. And from the company perspective, it's enabling better, more cost-efficient decisions that drive down the overall health cost. So we're unique in that we apply our model to the entire continuum of care. So from wellness, ongoing health maintenance, all the way up to the most sort of complex, serious conditions, right? You pick your esoteric diagnosis that not many people have heard of, and then we connect people to the Darshaks of the world for congenital heart disease, right? So we make those connections for patients that wouldn't normally have access to that type of care. And we do it in a digital way, right? So we're the digital front door to providing the world with that specialized care. And we do it fast. So we work with over 4,000 physicians across 48 academic institutions in the country, and we can get a physician on the horn within, give or take, 48 hours to speak
What's
with
the
patients.
motivation to join the platform? Do they get a fee, or what? How do you persuade them to join the platform?
Right, yeah.
Obviously, that's the trick, isn't it?
part of the special sauce in all this, right, is why do providers engage with us? Why are they interested, right? And I think a lot of that gets back to the fact that we've shifted the paradigm of valuing expertise, right? We value what physicians have spent years and years trying to do, trying to perfect, trying to understand. From a technology perspective, right? Because that's, I guess, ultimately what this conference is about, right? We have a proprietary platform that makes communication exceedingly easy. We put the data that the physician needs for that interaction right in front of them. So in a couple minutes, they're up to speed on what they need to know about that patient, where the patient's been, where the patient's heading, how that provider can best help that patient. And then they're simply left to develop that physician-patient relationship and act in a patient-centered fashion without all the other systematic pressures that tend to exist in today's society for physicians functioning.
How does it work with insurance? Because insurance in the US is very regional, right? They're different, and people stay with insurance. It's quite high turnover.
Right.
How do you close the loop on a patient who's in New York, wants to see a Californian doctor, and their insurance doesn't allow it? Have you solved that problem?
Right. Well, yeah. So I think part of that's a work in progress, but a lot of right now, as we're scaling up, we tend to work with large group employers that are self-insured. So for them, this makes a huge difference.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a smaller part of the market you're working with.
Correct.
And then you hope eventually you can do that. Okay, interesting. And your other client base is employers. In a post-COVID world where the world of work more than likely will change, how do you kind of meet this challenge of remote management? The relationship with employer is going to change. Is it going to impact your business in any way?
Yeah, well, I think the great thing, a good thing, shall I say, about COVID, if there's much that exists, is that, geographic barriers have been broken down. And this gets a little bit actually interesting back to your regulation questions and something that Darshak was talking about earlier. But, I think one of the nice things that happened with COVID is that the geographic barriers in terms of licensing and what physicians could talk with patients in what states, that's actually very tightly regulated. And over the course of the last year, a lot of those regulations broke down. So, for example, prior regulations, I'm licensed in 4 different states, but I can't see patients outside of those 4 states, right, in a telemedicine capacity. And that all broke down with COVID, and that actually allowed for much more efficient care across the spectrum. And patients.
And that's structural, right? That ain't going back, is it?
I hope it doesn't.
Because once you've open the barriers, how can you then say you're going to put barriers back up again?
I think it's an open question. I don't know, and I'm not attuned enough to the political environment to understand that, where that's going to go. But I hope that does not come back. And similar, there were a lot of, social media platforms, for better or worse, or things that really allowed us to help communicate better. And gets back to your HIPAA question, right? There's a fine balance between access and then between privacy. And I think that breaking down those regulations allowed the access to really soar, to patients' benefits, in my opinion. And so I think where that balance is going to lie is going to be interesting to see.
Question for all of you really is about going back to the US healthcare system, which has always been about treating illness rather than preventing illness. And you get into the tyranny of the J code. You do your product, you get your code, and then you try and make money on the back of that code. And it's a kind of pact, isn't it, within the industry that the hospital gets paid per day rate, etc. Can you see the technologies you're working on to change that? How do you change that paradigm where you actually get rewarded for keeping people out of hospitals? And is that just an impossible thing to do in where we are today without some fundamental changes in the system? Or can you nibble away at the margin with some of the technologies you guys are working on? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to mention it. So I would say there's two pieces to this. The first is one has to create the appropriate financial incentive structure so that you want to keep people out of the hospital. So that's where global risk goes to some extent. And I think separating primary from secondary care fundamentally actually makes it very difficult because the incentives are just not aligned. So I'd say that there's a set of sort of key incentives that have to be laid out. The second piece of it, and I believe there's an enormous role for technology in this area, but it's to really be clear about how that is going to be prevented. And this is an analytic problem. For example, one needs to understand in the population you're serving, what are the major sources of hospitalizations? In some parts of the world, it's going to be asthma. It may be uncontrolled diabetes. In other parts of the world, it may be malaria. And in other parts of the world, it might be falls from elderly individuals who have balance issues because they're overtreated for high blood pressure. That is the analytic work that has to be done, rather than a sort of a faith-based approach that just throwing technology into the home is somehow magically going to lead people to avoid getting healthier. But that has to be clinically informed. And the last thing I'll say is that, in my view, there will not be a single technology that will fix everything. This is an incremental approach, and it'll be a series of 1% to 2% solutions. In some areas, it will be very close monitoring and treatment of high blood pressure in an outpatient setting after discharge for congestive heart failure. In others, it will be significantly making it easier to access and ensure that there's home-based delivery of medications for COPD or asthma or pulmonary. And we can sort of go down that list, but I think it's very important to have a very tailored and data-driven approach as we decide, well, how do we attack these one by one?
Mary?
I double click on the point on global risk that Darshak was mentioning. I mean, that's a structural change that has the potential to be incredibly important, because for the first time, there's a very strong incentive, strong financial incentive, not just the well-being and better quality of care, to keep people out of the hospital. The holder of the risk, people taking full capitation, have an unbelievably high incentive, not just to reduce readmission, not just to reduce hospitalization, also to reduce ED visits and push it to urgent care or to primary care. And the closer the relationship between the physician and the patient is, and yes, technology has a role to play, it's not going to be the silver bullet. The relationship between the patient and their physician, and moving towards primary care, moving towards preventative care, moving towards early diagnostic and early and fast intervention, that's what it's all about. And technology can be a tool, but it's about incentives, and it's about the financial structure. And the more like we get exposed, we're newbies in this field, but the more we get exposed to the best of the best in the area of full capitated risk companies, just to name a few, like you look at the team at ChenMed, they really know what they're doing. And you see that the way they're solving this is a higher physician to patient ratio, more direct touch points between physician and patient. Yes, a lot of technology, but mainly to analyze data, to help understand trends, to help understand and to help arm the physician with what's working, predict what might happen. And that I think is what it's all about. It's just the move towards primary care and away from emergency medicine.
Mary, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah. I'd also say, especially from a clinical perspective, I think you can do the background build of all these different financial incentives, financial models, et cetera. And the bottom line is, unless the patients agree, unless the patients feel like their needs are being met, it's all going to fall apart. And so I think that's also where high quality interactions is really important. And the quality of how we build this and how we roll it out is going to be so important. Just years of...
Do you think the whole kind of wearable, clearly all of us have played around with it and have them, but do you think the wrong cohort, i.e. the worried well have the wearables and the people who need to have them don't? How do you incentivize that? Or do you think it's quite this way, something about diabetics, COPD, etc.? So is it changing?
It's a good question. I mean, I think they're becoming pervasive enough that it's hopefully expanding across the spectrum of all. I think it depends. I think a lot of it depends on where the patient's home base is, to be honest, and what and what at the major academic institution, the wearables are much more pervasive, right? And to everybody across the board, because they also have the funding to do that. Whereas if you go into rural areas, it's just not going to be there. So so the hope is that it goes everywhere, and to speaking to some of the, education points about, virtual care, the amount of information we can get, I sit here with a pulse ox on my finger, right? Because I can get a full set of vitals right up front when I see a patient, right? The first thing I do to them, I'm like, hey, do you have one of these at home? Right? Because every patient, courtesy of COVID now, has one at home for the most part. And, socioeconomic status aside, they're inexpensive.
And nobody knew what they were a year ago, right?
No, and now everybody has one. And
price went from $10 to $100 on Amazon within a month.
Right. So to get, so I do think that there's not as much lost in that, over a virtual medium that people think. And, again, I could go through many examples, and this is what we teach people about, but I can get a good oropharyngeal exam, right? You tell the patient to pretend they're swallowing the camera, and I can get a really good view down there, sometimes better than in the office. So we've learned how to be creative about it, and we've learned how to work around it.
That's a good idea. Question from the audience, and probably one for Dor here, about skin tones and kind of getting insight from robotics and how you measure skin tones and how decisions are made on to do with ethnicity, for example. Is there any kind of nuance in what allows you to do that and react, the data reacts in a different way, or is it mostly Caucasian-based trials and data sets?
Yeah, so quite frankly, I think that when you look at the basics, right, the ML-based models for computer vision and so on, all of us in the industry are using classifiers that are created and pushed in the public domain. They tend to be overfitted towards Caucasian populations. I don't know, regardless of what people are saying, I can tell you, looking at our team's work and so on, they're not well trained specifically for blacks and darker skin tones. And that's a shame. There's just no reason whatsoever that would be the case. But you take a commercial off-the-shelf classifier, you push a bunch of data on it, it's not going to work well for African Americans. And there's work to do there, I think, for all of us in the industry to firstly be aware of these biases, and then to look for data sets for training that are reflect the population and not the people building the algorithms.
It's the same with clinical trials, of course, right? Most clinical trials are done to a population set where people react differently to different drugs. There's work to do, even at the therapeutic end, I suppose.
And we see this in another area, right? I mean, we work on NLP, even on NLP side of understanding what people are saying, and in the creation of the character of the agent. Those things are also culturally, and by the way, they're not just black, white, Asian, Hispanic. They're also southern U.S. versus New York, San Francisco. The jokes you're going to say there and the ways to influence people are different. So as these things become more pervasive and more personalized, we're going to have to understand it's not a one-size-fits-all solution to really motivate people's behavior change. Sorry, Darshak, you
Yeah,
want
you actually want to come in? And then
I was just going to add that this is an area I think where I think we start a theme of where regulatory considerations often lag behind the technology concerns. This is a very good example. I'll just say it goes in every direction. For skin tone, for example, as Dor pointed out, the issue is the lack of appropriate training data. So, that has to be overrepresented. And so one has to create a large source of that training data, particularly for dermatologic conditions of people with different skin tones. On the other hand, if we look at predictive algorithms to identify high-cost, high-need populations, this is a really famous example from the US. We know that historically, African-American individuals, particularly in the South, have been underserved by healthcare. And so if you create training algorithms based on claims data there, you will perpetuate that lack of access. In other words, it looks as though individuals who are underserved are actually healthier or have less pain or have fewer needs. And so the algorithms you use to target services, in fact, will be misled. And so you actually will withhold services from those populations. And I think those of us that have been doing this for some time, over and over see these unintended pockets where we make errors because of assumptions. And so I don't want us to argue that this has to be highly regulated, but we do need to develop an approach by which we validate these algorithms before they become widely used. And my concern is that they're being broadly used and applied in ways that are invisible to many of us, and potentially harming patients without them being aware.
Right. On that note, that's very constructive. Good point. We have to say we have to finish to 4:55. And I say thank you to Mary, Dora, and Darshak for your valuable insights and thoughts. Hope you got something out of it, and I'm sure the debate's going to continue. I think we're probably year 1 or 2 of a 10-year journey on the convergence of health and data. So it's nice to be at the beginning of a trend rather than come at the end. So thank you very much for all your time, and appreciate your thoughts and insights.
Thank you so much for doing a great job moderating.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.